Yo, what's up, everybody? We live on Twitch. It's September 3rd, 2025. We're going to study the Constitution today. Switching over. Let me get this right. There we go. Oh, shoot. Can you guys see that? Oh, let me do that one more time. Oh, no. Have the wrong text up. Constitution. Academy. Does that work? Oh no, I can't see my... Okay, there we go. Cool, got it. Yeah, last night I did some typing games. I realized there's gonna be like 2 days without me streaming. That's all good. Yeah, so last time I recall, what were we doing? Declaration of Independence, that's what we did. So, took the quiz, I passed it, but that's not gonna get me mastery. Gotta take the unit test, but I don't think I'm ready. 14%, oh, 13% of the way done. So, yeah, let's get to it. Um, Natural Rights Popular Sovereignty, and the Rule of Law. Also, found some new lo-fi, listening to that today. Oh, I don't want to take this right now. Oh, I could take this. Oh, let me finish watching this video.
And they're used by the authoritarian regime to establish rule by law. You know what I mean? Well, people understand the difference between rule by law and rule of law. So lots of totalitarian societies have constitutions, and they're used by the authoritarian regime to establish rule by law. You know what I mean? I can arrest you because it's here in my constitution. What we have is rule of law, and people know the difference between the two. What's scary is we're going through a process now outside the United States, in places around the world, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Israel, India, where the traditional power and hold of the Constitution is really being bent by strong leaders. And we need to get through this period and make sure that the rule of law wins. First time I went to Hong Kong, it just blew my mind. This little strip of island and these tall buildings reaching to the heavens. And I said, you know what that is? That's Chinese creative energy bounded by British rule of law. That's what you get when you put the two together. And what happened as mainland China has moved in more to Hong Kong? That rule of law weakens, you leak energy. Suddenly capital starts to move to Singapore, to Malaysia, to different places. And so the interface between the rule of law and your society and your economy is hugely important, because the rule of law is like a hard court in basketball. I'm a little guy, 5'7". Little guys, not me, but like me, could actually dunk a basketball off a hard court. The absence of the rule of law is like the sand in the desert. You can't jump a millimeter. America is the country it is for a lot of reasons, but most of all because we've attracted immigrants from all over the world who are both high energy and aspiring, and because we attracted people who are high IQ, risk takers. And it's the two together. And why do they come here? I mean, it's a big world. They come here because they know there's this constitution, and if they behave properly, sky's the limit, just like those buildings in Hong Kong. I was once in Abu Dhabi in the UAE, and I was checking into a hotel, and I had an Egyptian who was my porter. We're walking to the room, and I said, how do you like living here in the UAE? And he said, I like it a lot. I said, why? He said, they have good kanun here. Kanun is the Arabic word for laws. And it was always remembered that. He said they have good laws here. And it's not a full democracy by any stretch of the imagination. It doesn't even claim to be. But if people feel there's decency around them, that they'll get a fair shake, whether it's the Middle East or India or the United States, that's always going to attract high aspiring people, because they know their achievements will not be seized by the government. They know if they bring that energy, that high IQ risk, they start up online school, and it's wildly successful. The government's not going to look at it and say, nice little school you got there. We can really turn that into a big profit making thing. I think we'll take it. The next immigrant's not going to come here and start a school.
Okay, let me pull up my notes. Let's see. And if you guys are wondering what happened to part 3, part 3 got corrupted, unfortunately. Yeah, I don't have part 3 at all. Let's see. I have my notes up somewhere. Okay, let's see. Natural rights and conventional rights. Natural rights cannot be taken away. Can be taken away. Natural rights are given by the government. No. Natural rights are always listed in the Constitution. No. Natural rights are limited to citizens. No. According to the principle of rule of law, no. Law. So, the rule of law is the principle that every person, regardless of position or status, is subject to the law and must follow it. As John Adams stated, this means that the nation has a government of laws, not of men. Nice. Which principle of the American Revolution did Abraham defend in his Lyceum address? I don't remember. Shit. Damn. Duh, talking about it. Natural light, liberty, friendship, that's nice. Bonus question. Well, okay, I want to given by God. While some people may believe that unalienable rights come from God, this belief is not essential to the definition of the word. Others believe that unalienable rights come from nature or are inherent. This is the best definition of unalienable. Unalienable rights cannot be removed or denied to any individual. Opening paragraphs. Oh man. Here we go. Oh, it's not that big. Background. On July 4th, 1776, the United States officially declared its independence from the British Empire with the Second Continental Congress adopted when the Second Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. The declaration was authored by a committee of 5: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman, with Jefferson as the main drafter. But Jefferson himself later admitted that he was merely looking to reflect the mind of Americans, bringing together the core principles at the heart of the American Revolution. The Declaration has also included a list of grievances against King George III, explaining to the world why American colonies were separating from Great Britain. The American Revolution ended with the Battle of Yorktown in 1781 and the Treaty of Paris in 1783. A little over 2 decades after King George III took the throne, the American people had broken from Great Britain and begun a new experiment in Republican government. Okay. Excerpt in Congress, July 4th, 1776. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one person to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind require that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form, so them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that government long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such a government, to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The system of the present King of Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny of the United States. Why do I have to? You don't have to learn this specific freaking code. Why do I have to learn this? Come on, man. Ratio. Very useful too. Instead of learning the history of the whole world that you will never use, learn the history and laws of your own country. Additionally, if you decide to become a judge or a politician, this will prove to be very useful. Okay, that's your question. Facts. 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 Scary what schools. Good thing I know the first president. Facts. Facts. Tips. Nice. Video time. Yes, positive music. Created equal.
The founders were realists. They knew perfectly well that there were a vast number of respects in which human beings are not equal. We're not equal in height and weight and so forth, of course. In respect after respect after respect, people are not equal. Now, what should follow from that for how government should regard the interests of people? Should government favor, treat as more worthy, those who are stronger, more powerful, more highly educated? And the founders say, well, no. Rather, in the most fundamental respect, that is, in respect of the dignity and worth of a person, the government must treat all as equal. All as equal in worth and dignity. It can't favor the interests of some over the others on the basis of any of those other factors. And this has kind of radical implications when you think about it. That most societies have not historically recognized the equal dignity of all members of the human family, or all members even of their communities. We ourselves, as a society, our polity, although we paid lip service early on to the principle of equality, we had a vicious system of racial discrimination. First with slavery, and then with Jim Crow. It took an awful lot of struggle and work to overcome that discrimination, and we still live today in certain respects with the legacy of that discrimination. But most societies and most times in human history have thought that there are some people who are inherently inferior and other people who are inherently superior. And that's what's repudiated by the Declaration. The Declaration holds there are no inherent superiors or inferiors.
Liberty.
Liberty, that's another tricky one. These ideas look so simple when we see them. Yeah, equality, I know what that means. 2 equals 2. That's what equality is. But we see that they have many different shades of meaning. So today, if I say liberty, we invoke it to mean the same thing as freedom. Like, I am at liberty to get up and walk out of the room right now. I have the liberty to go about my social and political life as I would like to. Liberty in the 18th century, however, has a very precise and technical political meaning. And what it simply means is the liberty to be able to exercise your political rights against the overweening tyranny of a monarch. It also means that you have the right to be represented at some level in your government. But it essentially means freedom from tyranny. They imagined it as being a very fragile ideal, that tyranny was this big, powerful, green monster that often took the form of a king, and liberty was this fragile entity that could easily be attacked by a tyrant. That is to say that they conceived liberty not as a social quality, not as an individual quality, but as a political quality, which is the freedom from tyranny. And they invoked it because they said that the British Parliament, by not representing the colonies in Parliament, was taxing them without their representation, and that was a form of tyranny. So liberty, again, today, it's synonymous with freedom. We use the word liberty very promiscuously. It's liberty this, liberty that. But it's important to remember that in the 18th century, it had a very precise political and rather technical meaning that then loosened up over the course of the 19th century.
Okay, cool. Video, yes. Pursuit of happiness.
Pursuit of happiness, this is such an excellent line in the Declaration of Independence, and yet we misunderstand it completely. So when we imagine pursuing happiness today, we imagine it as private happiness, driving a Tesla or going on a nice vacation, eating ice cream, all of these things we imagine as the pursuit of happiness. But in the 18th century, they had a second concept of happiness in addition to what they called private happiness. They called it public or social happiness. And you can find this in all of the letters of the founders. And they essentially imagined it in the way that we today imagine national security, as the need to think of the state, of something outside of ourselves, of the larger good, of the public good, and to give our lives to upholding that public good. So not always pursuing our private happiness, pursuing things that are, I guess what the Romans would call the res publica, the things public. So the 18th century way of reading the Declaration of Independence would be to say, we want life, liberty, and we want the ability to pursue the public good, freedom from outside attack and freedom from inside insurrections. So that's why I say that it's much closer to the idea of national security than to eating ice. Idea of national security than to eating ice cream on a spring day. And we have to remember the context, right? Is that the United States in 1776 is this very, very fragile little entity surrounded by these really scary monarchies, and also within itself having all kinds of potential dissenters, slave insurrections, loyalist insurrections, and everybody needed to essentially come together to think of the larger good rather than their own self-absorbed desires. So it's interesting, to reread the Declaration of Independence with fresh eyes on happiness.
Okay, interesting, interesting. Another window. Here you go. Alright, this is as big as it's gonna get. Cool. Nice. Oh, let's just watch this. Let's talk about virtue. Virtue.
Well, I think when you become a republic, you're saying, look, we're going to have elected officials, not officials that are foisted on us by monarchs. The position is assumed simply because of their father and their grandfather and so on, going back in time immemorial. So republics, power flows from the bottom up. A monarchy the power flows from the top down. So if it's going to come from the bottom up, then that's a fragile kind of state. It depends on people who are virtuous, meaning people who are willing to sacrifice their private interests for the sake of a public good. Res publica means public things, public good. It's a radical step to take to move into republicanism. It requires a special kind of people, and Americans felt they were that kind of people in 1776, able to support a Republican government that depended on the caliber or the character of the people in the society. Very few people expected or understood in the 18th century that people could sustain a government. There were no republics left of any size by the 18th century. Rome was the last great republic, and the question was, could we sustain a republic in this modern day? And they asked themselves that question over and over, and it was debated everywhere. Do we have sufficient virtue? John Adams had many doubts that we had. Too many people were trying to make money at the expense of the public good. So it was always a question, and of course it remains a question for us even today. Do we have the caliber and character to sustain this kind of government that's based on consent? And it's really a perennial question for democratic societies.
Interesting.
The founders start from this idea of natural justice, right? We're all equal. We all have authority over our own lives. Yet we're not all perfectly just. I have 3 kids, they're 10, 9, and 5, and I can attest that we're not all just by nature. Right? We're all selfish by nature, and we take things that are not ours. Even though there's a natural moral law, we don't all follow it. And the reason we create government is to enforce justice, to enforce the natural moral law, to keep us from violating one another's rights, to secure our rights so we can live together in peace and prosperity. But sometimes, unfortunately, those who we grant power to help us secure our rights to pursue the common good use it for their own good. participate further in the Declaration. If there's a long train of abuses and government becomes tyrannical, the founders' argument, the argument of the Declaration of Independence, the argument of natural justice is when government becomes tyrannical, we can overthrow it. And then they institute a new government. And that, in fact, is what the founders are doing with the Declaration of Independence. They're saying this government, the King of England, has become tyrannical. These are the reasons why we believe this government is tyrannical. We're making an argument that invoking our natural right to revolution is justified in this case. We are throwing off this government, and then we will institute a new government to protect our right to safety and happiness on principles of justice, and we'll do that via consent. And that first becomes the Articles of Confederation, and then the new federal constitution, which we still live under today.
They didn't talk about slavery though. What did this have to do with slavery? Yo, what's up, Olivia Ben? Thanks for joining the stream. How you doing today? You look familiar. So far, so good. Cool, cool. I'm chill. How are you? Oh, are you a graphic artist? I'm doing just fine today. Glad to hear that. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, me too. I'm a graphic artist as well. But yeah, I'm just studying the Constitution today. Just to... Where did he talk about slavery? I was trying to see where they talked about slavery in the U.S. in this video. What is it? I have a question. Why is the video titled? Why work for streamers and gamers, and there's stuff like logos, banners, overlays, alerts, panels, emotes, intros, and outros. All are very. Would you like to view some of my work? No, it's okay. I'm good. I think I got it. I mean, like I said, I'm a graphic designer too. I don't think I need that stuff right now, but yeah, maybe somebody else could use your business. I think I'm all right at the moment. I don't think I need too many graphics at the moment. I have like be right back screens and whatnot, so I'm good right now, but thanks for asking. Make sure to drop a follow, check it out. Yeah, I'm online today, tomorrow, the next day. Feel free to stop by. Slavery, but slavery is not directly mentioned in the... Where are you from, Olivia? Let's do this exercise. According to the Principles of Declaration of Independence, what action can people take when they face tyrannical government? Overthrow and replace it. Yeah. What did the authors of the Declaration of Independence mean by liberty? Freedom from tyranny. What statement is true about Republican government in the 18th century? No. 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 What was virtue to the founders? Virtue in a civic sense. Okay, so virtue in a civic sense means prioritizing the common good over personal gain. I'll write that down. That sounds important. Virtue. Olivia, are you from Pakistan? She's still here? No, she left. Oh man. Oh shoot. I was about to play this. Oh man, whatever. It's all good. That was pretty easy. Oh, exercise again. Okay, let's do it. Okay, Blackstone. This is an excerpt from Jonathan Elliott's The Debates in Several State Conventions of the Adoption of a Federal Constitution. The speaker is James Wilson speaking at Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention. I mentioned that Blackstone will tell you that in Britain, supreme authority is lodged in the British Parliament, and I believe there is no writer on the subject on the other side of the Atlantic, but supposed it to be vested in that body. I stated further that if the question was asked of some politician who had not considered the subject with sufficient accuracy, where the supreme power resided in our governments, he would answer that it was vested in the state constitutions. Okay, listen. I wish I could highlight. Dang, that'd be so cool if we could highlight. This opinion approaches near the truth, but does not. Oh. Oh, shoot, I could do this. In the state constitutions. This opinion approaches near the truth, but not reach it. For the truth is that the supreme, absolute, and uncontrollable authority remains with the people. I'm glad I could write on these too. That's cool. I also mentioned that the practical recognition of this truth was reserved for the honor of this country. I recollect no constitution founded on this principle, but we have witnessed the improvement and enjoyment of happiness by seeing it carried into practice. The great and penetrating mind of Locke seems to be the only one that pointed even towards the theory of this great truth, which statement best summarizes Wilson's argument in this excerpt. For perspective, people. For governments to be successful, the people must agree to give up some of their power to the authority of the state. The power of the American government, unlike the British people, is given to the subject will of the people. Supreme authority of the government, unlike that of the British government, rests with the states. Not that, well, it didn't say that. See this one. Yep. Explanation. Wilson says that the truth is that the supreme, absolute, and uncontrollable authority remains with the people. He contrasts the American system of government with that of Britain, where he says supreme authority is lodged in the British Parliament. I'm freaking scared off Olivia Ben. It's all good. Let's see. This is an excerpt from John Adams' reply of the House to Hutchinson's first message. But further to show the sense of the English crown and nation that the American colonists and our predecessors in particular, when they first took possession of the country by the Great Charter from the crown, by a grant and charter, from the crown did not remain subject to the supreme authority of Parliament. We beg leave to observe that when a bill was offered to the two houses of Parliament to King Charles I, granting the subjects of England the free liberty of fishing on the coast of America, he refused his royal assent, declaring as reason the colonies were without realm and jurisdiction of the Parliament. Declaring the colonies were not without realm jurisdiction of Parliament. Okay. In like manner, his predecessor James I had before declared upon a similar occasion that America was not annexed to the realm, and it was not fitting that Parliament should make laws for those countries. If then the colonies were not annexed to the realm, and the time when their charters were granted, they could never be afterwards without their own special consent. Wait. If the colonies were not annexed to the realm, at the time when the charters were granted, they could never be afterwards without their own special consent, which never since been had, or even asked if they are. What is to the realm? I don't know what that means. Question mark. If they are not now annexed to the realm, they are not part of. They are not a part of the kingdom. No country, consequently not subject to the legislative authority of the kingdom. For no country by the common law was subject to the laws or to the parliament, but to the realm. Oh, okay. Which statement best describes Adams' argument in the passage? Parliament is a ruling body. American colonies and Great Britain. So the kingdom was. Parliament has no right to rule over the colonies, as the colonists have no colonial representation. Parliament only virtual representation. Parliament has no power to rule over. Parliament can rule over the colonies only once they receive votes from. I don't think this is the answer. Parliament has no power to rule over the American colonies, as guaranteed. Ah, shit, this one. Okay, why is it not this one? This passage does not address representation in Parliament. Okay, Adams argues that the original charters granted to the colonies do not subject the colonies to Parliament's authority. So Parliament has no power to rule over the American colonies, as is guaranteed by the original contracts. Okay. This is an excerpt from the Virginia Declaration of Rights by George Mason. Section 1. That all men are by nature equal, free, and independent, and have certain inherent rights in which they enter into a state of society. They cannot, by any compact, deprive or divest their posterity. Namely, the enjoyment of life, liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. This section of the Virginia Declaration focuses on which principle? Pursuit of happiness. Oh. Natural rights. Yeah, inherent rights. Okay. This is an excerpt from Common Sense, 1776, by Thomas Paine. But where, says some, is the King of America? I'll tell you, friend, he reigns above, and doth not make havoc of mankind like the Royal of Britain. Wait, what? Yet that we may not appear to be defective even in earthly honors, let a day be solemnly set apart for proclaiming the charter. Let it be brought forth and placed on the divine law, the word of God. The word of God. Let a crown be placed thereon, by which the world may know, so that as we approve of monarchy, that in America the law is king. Ooh. The law is king, guys. Listen, and read. Law is king. For as in absolute governments the king is law, so in free countries the law ought to be king, and there ought to be no other. But lest any ill use should afterwards rise, let the crown at the conclusion of the ceremony be demolished, and scattered among the people whose right it is. Let any ill rise at the crown. Honestly. He doth not make havoc of mankind like the Royal of Britain. Dang, savage. In Britain, the king hands down the law, but in America, she returns to nature without laws. In Britain, people follow the king, but in America, people follow the institution. Best summarizes. In Britain, God decides Well, law should be followed by America, the people decide. The law should be, yeah, I think this is, yeah. Payne says that Britain, the king's word is law. He argues that America, the law itself, should be the ultimate authority. In America, the law is king. Yep, there we go. Bonus question time. Okay. Which principle does Payne mainly argue for? For rule of law. Yeah. Payne argues that in America, the law should be the ultimate authority, reflecting the principle of rule of law. Nice. There we go. Lesson 6 time. Alright, here we go. Why do American colonists fight them?
My graduate advisor, John Murray, in his undergraduate classes used to say, in 1760, Great Britain had a 15-game lead with 20 games left to play. There's no way they can blow this. How did they do so? Well, stick around, so you'll find out. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that it's counterintuitive. It's unlike what we would expect, but the only way to understand the coming of the American Revolution is to first understand how deeply and sincerely convinced colonial Americans were that they were British and they were loyal subjects of the British king. Because to be a loyal subject of the British king by the 6th decade of the 18th century meant that you had a certain standing and certain rights and could have certain expectations of government. The only reason they felt that they had that standing and those expectations and rights was because they were British. And it was when the British came to doubt the colonial Americans' Britishness and began to deny access to those rights and to that standing and insist that they were something other than and less than British, that American colonists began to organize around the idea they could not be safe any longer in the British Empire. But the only way that they could even understand how to articulate what was angering and what they felt that was being done to them was wrong was to first believe that they were British and therefore were entitled to all of the things that came with what they understood to be British liberties and British rights. Why is it important to be British in 1760? Why would Americans or people living in Britain want to be British? And the way that they would explain it is that the key benefits of being British are first that we're not French and therefore not Catholic, that Britain is a Protestant nation and a Protestant empire, and therefore is joined in a great and righteous and holy war against the forces of Antichrist, represented on earth by the Pope in Rome and the most powerful Catholic prince in Rome, which is the King of France. And that being Protestant also then went with the values that made Protestantism the only proper version of the Christian faith. That it was an open, enlightened religion of the book, not a religion of the word, of the book, of understanding, of comprehension, of civilization, as opposed to one of superstition, British liberties and British rights. Why is it important to be British in 1760? Why would Americans or people living in Britain want to be British? And the way that they would explain it is that the key benefits of being British are first that we're not French and therefore not Catholic, that Britain is a Protestant nation and a Protestant empire, and therefore is joined in a great and righteous and holy war against the forces of Antichrist, represented on earth by the Pope in Rome and the most powerful Catholic prince in Rome, which is the King of France. And that being Protestant also then went with the values that made Protestantism the only proper version
I don't know why I put Jewish. He said French and Catholic.
of the Christian faith. That it was an open, enlightened religion of the book, not a religion of the word, of the book, of understanding, of comprehension, of civilization, as opposed to one of superstition and darkness and ignorance, all of which were fertile ground for despotism and oppression. And so interestingly, in many ways, they saw that kind of ideal Christianity as also connected with all sorts of economic rights and property rights. The Protestant, who came from an open, enlightened, civilized, progressive religion, was also a person who then could pursue his own ideals and interests in both spiritually, but also economically and materially. So it was Protestants, therefore, who could stress that the importance of liberty of conscience and liberty of freedom also came with the importance of liberty and freedom in general. And the only way to be truly free from a potentially oppressive state was to not be dependent upon that state. And the key way to not be dependent upon that state was to be able to have secure possession of your own property, or your own wealth, and protect it from the state's efforts to try and take it from you. Because people with their own property and their own wealth had the freedom to think for themselves, to act for themselves, and to criticize when necessary. And that's where we get this very famous phrase that everybody listening to us will have heard of, this idea of no taxation without representation. That was the key way in which people in Britain and in the colonies, going all the way back to the 16th and 17th centuries, understood as the key way to protect their rights of property. And the thinking was that if you live in a state, if you live in a government, and the government needs to do all kinds of things that increasingly in the 17th and 18th century become more expensive, it's reasonable that the government should tax, that we subjects who enjoy the benefits of the government and enjoy the protections and freedoms that government affords should contribute to the well-being of that government. And the way they do that is by the government taking a portion of their property and making taxation and making use of it. That's what taxation is. That's what your parents are listening to. When they pay taxes, they're acknowledging the government is going to take a portion of their property to serve the broader public good. But the question is how much and who gets to determine? And what if a government becomes so powerful they can tax away all of it, to the point where you no longer have enough property to sustain your own freedom and then become ripe for despotism and oppression? And that's where this notion of how to protect property becomes such a key cardinal part of British liberties. And the way the British argue that they can both accept legitimate taxation but also be safe in the property is if two things are true. One is that those who are determining how much taxes are to be paid are chosen by the taxpayers or elected by the taxpayers. And the second thing is that those who are doing the taxing are required to pay the same taxes they're requiring of other people. If you have both of those things, you have taxation connected to representation, and the taxpayers are choosing those who tax them, and the people who are doing the taxing are not expecting anyone to pay taxes. They themselves also don't have to pay. That places a limit on how much a government will tax, because the taxers will be hurting themselves if they tax too much, and if the people find it unacceptable, they could vote them out. And those are cardinal ideals of British liberty: the freedom to practice the proper Christian religion of Protestantism, and the freedom to be secure in your property, which go hand in hand. And those are things that British believe in the 18th century only their government, only their form of monarchy, not an absolutist monarchy, but a limited monarchy that doesn't claim to be above law and above fundamental right, that only British people get to enjoy. And so those rights colonists insisted they have by virtue of being British too. So when it becomes clear to them over the course of the 1760s and 1770s that Britain doesn't really think that those same British rights extend to British people living in the colonies, that things can be done to them that would be unthinkable to do to British people living in Britain, the colonists have to think about how they best can protect the rights they thought had been protected, but now seem to no longer be.
Oh, it's a big one. Info brief: the constitutional story of the American Revolution. The Revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was effected from 1760 to 1775, in the course of 15 years before a drop of blood was drawn at Lexington. John Adams to Thomas Jefferson, August 24th, 1815. In 1760, the American colonists were loyal to British subjects. 15 years later, the colonies were at war with the British Empire. What happened? In December 1760, the American colonists were proud British subjects, and they greeted the news of their king, 22-year-old King George III, with jubilation. They loved their new king. They loved being part of the British Empire. They loved the British Constitution and its many liberties. They thought it the envy of the world, and they believed themselves to be entitled to all the rights of Englishmen. They didn't view themselves as second-class subjects. At the same time, the American colonists were an afterthought. To the new king, his royal officials, and members of parliament. As a result, as a practical matter, the British Empire mostly left the American colonists alone, allowing them to govern themselves. But what would happen if the situation changed? What if the British Empire began to meddle in the American colonies? What if the British Empire began to enforce its anti-smuggling laws against American merchants? What if the British Empire began to second-guess the decisions of popularly elected colonial assemblies? What if the British Empire began to cast aside cherished liberties like the right to a jury trial? What if the British Empire sent thousands of troops to American shores without the consent of the colonists in time of peace? And what if Parliament attempted to raise new revenue by taxing the colonists without their consent? Over the course of 15 years, from 1760 to 1775, the American colonists went from loyal British subjects to the brink of revolution. On April 19th, 1775, shots were fired in the town of Lexington, Massachusetts. Blood had been shed. By 1776, the American colonists were ready to declare independence from the British Empire. This is the constitutional story of the American Revolution. Okay. For the full story, Professor Akhil Reed Amar of Yale University argues that the push for American Revolution independence required three key ingredients: personal. The revolutionaries had to be ready to break away from the British Empire personally. They had to cast aside the king, the British people, and Parliament. In other words, they had to be ready to say that they were no longer British subjects. This was a big deal. Military. The revolutionaries had to believe that they could actually win the fighting war with the British Empire. Legal. The revolutionaries needed to develop a constitutional theory to counter Parliament's push to raise taxes and shape policy in the American colonies. Now let's take a deeper look at some of the key developments of the road to the American Revolution. James Otis and the Writs of Assistance. Heard of this before. To understand the story of the American Revolution, let's begin with the famous episode, James Otis and the battle over the Writs of Assistance. The year is 1761, 15 years before the Declaration of Independence. The place is Boston. As a result of the 7 Years' War, the British Empire had started to enforce long-standing anti-smuggling acts in the colonies. They were known as the Navigation Acts. Anti-smuggling acts. The colonists had been breaking these laws for years, for instance, through illegal smuggling. And on its old policy of salutary neglect, the British Empire turned a blind eye to this illegal trading. But no more. The British began to tighten their control over American colonies. Why did the British Empire change its policy? Because the Empire had a massive war debt. It needed money, and the colonists in America had it. Interesting. As a shift in policy, King George III uses royal officials in the colonies to crack down on tax evaders and colonial smugglers with the use of so-called writs of assistance. These writs, gave royal officials, here customs officials, free range to break into the homes or ships of colonists to search for evidence anytime, anywhere, for any reason. The colonists were outraged. Yeah, I'd be pretty pissed too if people just start breaking into my shit. Enter James Otis. Otis was a prominent Boston lawyer and patriot. He took on the smugglers' cause and attacked the writs of assistance. These smugglers were largely local merchants who looked to challenge the writs of assistance in court. These legal challenges eventually found their way to Massachusetts High Court, presided over by Thomas Hutchinson. Eventually, Hutchinson would emerge as the most prominent loyalist in America. In the writs of assistance, and in a 5-hour speech, Otis argued that the Massachusetts court should declare these writs in violation of the British Constitution, the English common law, and the colonists' natural rights. For Otis, these writs violated a core principle: a man's house as his castle, and whilst he is quiet, he is as well guarded as a prince. In Otis's view, the writs of assistance violated the British Constitution. They violated English common law. Yo, I need a massage. Ugh. English. Okay, let's see. They violate English as human beings. With this argument, we can already see that the roots of a novel theory that the colonists might later deploy to attack the constitutionality of British laws. Otis described the writs of assistance as, quote, the worst instrument of arbitrary power, the most destructive of English liberty, and the fundamental principles of the Constitution that ever was founded in an English law book. From there, Otis argued that the writs were unconstitutional under British Constitution, and that the Massachusetts courts should declare them void. Well, this may sound like a pretty conventional argument today. Of course, wow. What is this? Not nonsense. What is this fragment of a sentence? Of course, unconstitutional acts should be invalidated by courts. That's why we have judicial review. But this was a radical argument for its time. Within the British constitutional system, Parliament was supreme. As a practical matter, it could do what it wanted. Otis lost the battle. Yes.
Nice job on the.
Okay. Otis lost the battle. The judges refused to invalidate the writs of assistance, but Otis wasn't forgotten. Many years later, John Adams, who, as a young man, heard Otis's arguments against the writs of assistance and was Otis's friend and fellow revolutionary, said that Otis's speech was the first scene of the first act of opposition to the arbitrary claims of Great Britain. Then and there, the child independence was born. The Sugar Act. James Otis set the foundation for the push towards independence. Oh, I just realized that this shit is getting blocked. Okay, if I go right here. James Otis set the foundation for the push towards independence. What were the key steps on the path to the Declaration of Independence? To begin, let's fast forward a few years to the Sugar and Stamp Act episodes of 1764 to 1766. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act. Under this act, the colonists would pay taxes on imported molasses. The British imposed these taxes to help pay for the costs associated with the 7 Years' War. To ensure that the colonists paid these new taxes, British would enforce alleged violations not through a regular jury trial, but instead through vice admiralty courts. These courts were run by royal judges. While colonial jurors often refused to punish alleged smugglers even if they were guilty of violating British law. New Vice Admiralty courts were put into place to crack down on illegal smuggling. Many colonists opposed the Sugar Act, expressing their opposition at town meetings, through assembly resolutions, and through petitions to King George III in Parliament. Their arguments were simple and powerful. First, they feared that British were attempting to set a new precedent. Traditionally, only elected representatives could enact taxes designed to raise revenue, but the colonists had no representation in Parliament. Their own colonial assemblies, elected by the colonists themselves, hadn't supported the Sugar Act. If colonists permitted the British to impose a small tax now, what would stop them from passing a much larger tax later? The famous colonial response: no taxation without representation. If Parliament wanted to impose a new tax to raise revenue from the colonists, it had to persuade the local assemblies elected by the colonists themselves to raise those taxes. Second, the American colonists believed the jury right as an important protection against the government abuse. The Sugar Act undermined that right by setting up Vice Admiralty courts to try alleged tax dodgers. What the hell is a Vice Admiralty court? The British government responded to the colonists with a theory of its own, the classic British theory. Parliament was supreme. It was free to govern the American colonists as it saw fit. In turn, it could pass new taxes to raise money from the colonists. Not only that, but it could pass whatever laws it wanted inside the American colonies. So that was... okay, it's interesting. The Stamp Act. In March 1765, Parliament then followed up with the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. This move was even more controversial. The Stamp Act required the colonists to purchase an imperial stamp for the use of various types of paper, including diplomas, court filings, and even newspapers. The British would use these taxes to raise revenue for the British government. Again, tax judges would face trial before Vice Admiralty courts, not traditional juries. Importantly, this new tax affected more colonists than the Sugar Act, and many of them were outraged. In Boston, mobs of colonists intimidated the would-be stamp collector, destroying the stamp office and ransacking the house. Oh, dang, okay. He decided against taking the job. Later, a Boston mob would lay waste to the mansion of Governor Thomas Hutchinson. 8 other colonies joined Boston in the fight against the Stamp Act. The arguments dovetailed with many of the critiques of the Sugar Act: no taxation without representation, and jury rights for Englishmen. Eventually, opposition leaders decided to meet in the first colonial assembly that brought leaders from various colonies, the Stamp Act Congress. There, 27 delegates and from 9 colonies met in New York's City Hall. In 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. However, Parliament also passed a declaratory act, reaffirming its own central constitutional argument and rejecting the colonial theory that challenged it. Parliament had full power and authority to make laws and statutes, to bind the colonies and people of America, in all cases whatsoever. So that is declaratory act, okay. Oh, shit. Dang. Okay. Townshend Acts. 15 months later, in 1767, Parliament enacted another set of colonial taxes, the Townshend Acts. These taxes covered a variety of imported goods, including tea. To aid enforcement, these new acts also allowed for a new set of writs of assistance. Many colonists opposed this new set of taxes. This led to a new wave of activity by the colonial opposition, including boycotts of British goods. Responding to the fears of many British customs officials, the British government also sent General Thomas Gage and 2,000 British troops to America, many of them landing in Boston. Even worse, the British Quartering Act required the colonists to pay these troops. Dang! So that's why we have the Third Amendment now. Oh, yeah, it's bad for my back. Okay. In the view of many colonists, This move ran afoul of a basic constitutional maxim: no standing armies in time of peace. In short, the colonists feared that the British government would use these troops to harass the colonists and abuse their rights. Boston Massacre. On March 5th, 1770, British soldiers stood guard at the Boston Customs House. A rowdy crowd of around 50 colonists harassed the soldiers, with some even tossing ice, snow, and other hard objects at them. In this chaotic atmosphere, the British soldiers fired into the crowd. Shortly thereafter, 5 colonists, including African-American sailor Crispus Attucks, lay dead on the street. In response to this bloodshed, Governor Thomas Hutchinson permitted regular criminal trials for 8 of the soldiers and their commanding officer, Captain Thomas Preston. At trial, they were represented by John Adams. Interesting. Okay. Even though he was a patriot, Adams put on a forceful case on behalf of his clients. What? Adams set out to prove that to everyone that, contrary to the views of King George III, his royal officials in Parliament, the Bostonians, were committed to the rule of law, and ordinary jurors in the American colonies could be trusted to dispense impartial justice. In the end, Adams was right, and most of the soldiers were acquitted of murder. Okay. Boston Tea Party. Fast forward 3.5 years, December 16th, 1773. Even though Parliament repealed most of the townshend duties, what was the townshend again? It's a townshend, okay. Even though Parliament replaced most of the townshend duties, it left in place a tax on tea. Many colonists accepted this compromise. However, the Bostonians didn't, and said the Sons of Liberty hatched a plan. The result? The Boston Tea Party. To keep ships from unloading British tea into Boston, Sons of Liberty boarded the ships carrying the tea, cracked open 342 chests, and tossed the British tea into the Boston harbor. Perhaps John Adams best captured what this moment meant to the Boston Patriots. This is the greatest event which has ever yet to happen since the controversy with Britain opened. The sublimity of it charms me. The British Empire's response. The British Empire responded with a series of coercive acts meant to isolate Boston from the rest of the colonies and crush the Sons of Liberty and their allies. With the coercive acts, the British government shut down the economic engine of the city, Boston Harbor, allowed British soldiers to be tried for crimes committed in America back in England, escaping the justice of ordinary colonial juries. The colonists called this the Murder Act. Okay. And passed a new quartering act that gave military the authority to force colonists to house soldiers in their homes. Rather than teaching Bostonians a lesson or isolating them from the rest of the colonies, these coercive acts, nicknamed the Intolerable Acts by the colonists, backfired, strengthening the resolve of the Patriots in Boston and bringing the various colonies closer together. It also brought them closer to revolution. Not surprisingly, Bostonians took the lead in opposing the coercive acts, opening up lines of communication, called Committees of Correspondence, between various colonies. The coercive acts also drove some colonial leaders to begin to flirt with more radical constitutional arguments. Up until then, most critics of the British Empire settled on a theory that attacked certain British taxes, but with Parliament with broad authority to shape colonial policy. Cries of no taxation without representation might not offer the colonists reasons to oppose a new wave of British taxes, but the coercive acts proved to many colonial leaders that this theory, though potent in certain circumstances, was inadequate to address the new challenges. Other laws, like the coercive acts, had proven to be even more oppressive than the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, and Townshend Acts. As a result, some colonists began to embrace radical constitutional theories that challenged Parliament's authority to legislate for the colonies altogether. On this view, Parliament was so distant from the colonies that it was unfit to represent their interests. In short, the colonists should be able to govern themselves. First Continental Congress. In September 1774, over 50 delegates from 12 different colonies met in the First Continental Congress. These representatives assembled to assembled to respond to the coercive acts. The congressional delegation included many leading colonists, including Virginia's Richard Henry Lee, Patrick Henry, George Washington, New York's John Jay, Massachusetts' John Adams, and Samuel Adams. In the end, Congress called for the repeal of the Coercive Acts and threatened a boycott of British goods if Parliament didn't comply. The delegates also scheduled another meeting in Philadelphia, May 1775. Yo, I remember watching Liberty Kids as a child, and yeah, a lot of this was Boston Tea Party was in the intro. Yeah, I wish I watched Liberty Kids a little bit more. That was really educational. Oh yeah, maybe I'll check out Liberty Kids later today. Even so, Congress still remained loyal to King George III, sending him a petition with their list of grievances. The king never responded. Before Congress could assemble again, the colonists and British troops had already met on the fields of Lexington and Concord. On April 1775, British soldiers met colonial militiamen on the Lexington Town Green in Massachusetts. British soldiers fired on the colonists, killing 8 militiamen, with only 1 British soldier wounded in the battle. In response, thousands of colonists gathered in the neighboring town of Concord to fight the British troops. More than 100 people died in the Battle of Concord. Oh, shit. The British troops and the colonists continued to fight for the next several weeks, culminating in the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775, more than a year before the Declaration of Independence. Over 1,000 people died in the battle. Following this wave of bloodshed, colonists had to make a fateful choice: to remain loyal to Britain or join the Patriots. The Second Continental Congress. On May 10th, 1775, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, with many of the same delegates assembled. However, the circumstances had changed considerably since Congress's last meeting. Less than a month later, militiamen battled British troops at Lexington and Concord. In turn, Massachusetts had begun to build a military force to keep up the fighting, and it was now calling on other colonies to send in troops. In addition, Benjamin Franklin was back in Philadelphia after over a decade of serving as representative for the American colonies in London. Franklin was the most celebrated and famous American in the world, yet his service in London ended in embarrassment. In Franklin's view, despite a lifetime of loyal service, the British government had treated him like a second-class subject. He returned to America filled with resentment and ready to join the Patriots. Needless to say, they were happy to welcome him to the fight. The Pennsylvania Assembly immediately sent Franklin to the Second Continental Congress, where he joined John Adams, Samuel Adams, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Richard Henry Lee. Congress chose Boston's John Hancock as its presiding officer, and John Adams put forward Virginia's George Washington to head the new Continental Army. During this session, the members of Congress took an ambitious agenda, preparing the colonies for war with Britain, working to build support for independence, both inside Congress and outside of it, and try to deepen the political ties between the various colonies. Importantly, some members of Congress, led by John Dickinson, still worked for peace with George III in Parliament. Dickinson even won Congress's support to send what is known as the Olive Branch Petition, explaining to the king that colonists remained loyal to the crown, opposed independence, and simply wanted him to respond to their concerns, honor their rights as Englishmen, and get rid of Parliament's oppressive laws. King George III wasn't interested in the appeals of colonial leaders. He didn't even read their petition. Instead, in late August 1775, he branded the American colonists traitors and rebels. In his view, they were in open rebellion and had to be crushed. Thomas Paine's Common Sense. In the fall of 1775, the colonists were divided over the issue of independence. Some remained loyal to the crown. Others became patriots. Others became patriots. Oh my gosh. Still, many remained undecided. In this environment, Thomas Paine's Common Sense hit the American colonies like a thunderbolt in January of 1776. In Common Sense, Paine attacked the British monarchy, called for American independence and envisioned the creation of republican governments based on the consent of the people. In the process, he convinced many colonists to think anew. Over time, the war spread across colonies. Royal governments fell, and informal patriot assemblies took to the task of governing America. In May 1776, Congress passed a resolution proposed by John Adams calling for the colonies to set up new state governments. The American colonies responded by crafting new state constitutions. This was a constitutional revolution itself, with the new states committing to written constitutions rooted in the consent of the governed. Okay. Declaring independence. I think after this reading passage, I'm going to call it. On July 2nd, 1776, a unanimous Congress declared independence, adopting a motion introduced by Virginia's Richard Henry Lee and seconded by John Adams. Here's the text of the Lee resolution. Resolved that these state colonies are, and right to be, free and independent states. They are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. The Declaration of Independence soon followed. In addition to an inspiring account of the principles at the core of the American idea, the Declaration was also a formal declaration by Congress to the rest of the world that the United States was now an independent nation. To justify this move, the Declaration also described King George III's long train of abuses against the colonists. Let's get a few more. Above all, the king violated the social contract. He hadn't kept the colonists safe. He hadn't promoted their happiness. Instead, he stood aside as Parliament passed oppressive laws as his royal officials abused the colonists. In fact, rather than listening to the colonists' petitions and addressing their grievances, the king ignored their pleas and declared war on them. Here's how the colonists explained the king's key flaw in the Declaration itself. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. So the king and the British Empire itself had to go. A bloody war followed, ending with the Battle of Yorktown in 1781 and the Treaty of Paris in 1783. A little over 2 decades after King George III took the throne, the American people had declared independence, and defeated the British Empire, and begun the American experiment. Okay. Got some videos next. But yeah, I think I'll call it right there. Yeah, that was crazy. How the King George III just like freaking sent people to kill other people. But yeah, that'll conclude this part 4. See you guys in part 5.